Has sewing given you gear acquisition syndrome? It's a thing. What do you really need to start sewing? Before I get going on this video, I want once again to call on the seasoned sewers that do follow my channel. If I forget to put something in this list, please put it in the comments below. Let this video be a really great resource for people who are just starting out. I'm going to kind of do this in two tiers. First, we're going to talk about like the absolute essentials, the things you absolutely need to start sewing. And then I'm going to do sort of a second tier of stuff that are things that are super useful for almost any sewing project that you might have. They're not essential, but they're useful enough that they're worth having around kind of no matter what you're sewing. But they can be kind of like on the second round of acquiring supplies. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to bring up, of course, is going to be the sewing machine. This set, I know I said I'm doing the essentials list, and there are people who really love to hand sew and who make all of their garments hand sewing, and that's totally awesome. I'm putting the sewing machine on the essentials list because I think most people venturing into garment sewing probably are envisioning themselves using a sewing machine. Starting out, whatever machine you can get your hands on is fine. For a lot of people, you know, taking a secondhand machine and taking it in to be serviced instead of getting a new machine is going to be the best option for them. And you can get old machines that will never let you down. I have a 1970s Kenmore that is kind of like my backup machine. And even though it's my backup machine, I always use it when I sew stretch fabric because it is so much better than my newer Janome. If you are going the machine route, you're gonna want some extra bobbins because there's nothing more irritating than starting a new color of thread and having to like wind. First of all, this is just me. I will not wind over one color with another on my bobbin because it just is a waste. I won't ever like unwind it to go back to that first color. And if you have to go and unwind a bunch of thread and throw it in the garbage because you only have one or two bobbins, then that's wasteful too. So having these cuts down on your thread waste. Also, again, depending on your machine, look in your manual. You may need machine oil. And I recommend having some of these little paintbrushes around. These are from the dollar store. I went and got a pack of paintbrushes for my kids. I held a couple back for me. And this is for getting all of the little fuzzy bits out of your machine. And again, if you're gonna use a sewing machine, extra sewing needles. Don't let yourself run out of sewing needles and have different ones around that are appropriate for your fabric type. The reason why I say don't let yourself run out is number one, if you break a needle and you're in the middle of a project and it's 10 o'clock at night, it's so frustrating. But also, there are times where you're gonna have a problem, your thread is breaking a lot or it's bunching up and you can't figure out, you play with the tension, everything's fine. Often, your needle's dull and you just need to change your needle. So always have a lot of extra sewing needles around for your machine. Okay, the next thing is a pair of fabric scissors. Now you don't have to go and spend a whole bunch of money on like fancy fabric scissors to start. What I would recommend is getting yourself a pair of new scissors and keeping them just for fabric. Tell your family, tell everybody, if you really need to, you can get a little padlock to put around here. They should only be used for fabric. Down the road, if you feel like you really need to, you can upgrade to higher quality scissors that have a higher quality steel that hold their edge longer. But really, if you get a little bit used to sharpening your own scissors, I have a video for that here, then you'll be fine. Next, of course, is pins and something to put your pins in. If you are somebody who likes to wear artificial nails or has really long nails, I do recommend either having a pin dish with a magnet in it or just an extra fridge magnet kicking around because pins are hard to pick up when you've got nails. But for the most part, any pins and pin cushion will do. One thing to keep in mind when you are shopping for pins, especially if you're a new sewer, it can be really tempting to like just grab one of those little starter kits. The pins in those are always gonna have plastic beads on them. I highly recommend getting yourself pins with glass top beads because you can iron over them. And sometimes that's just gonna really be important, especially if you wanna save your fingers and not have to iron too close to your fingers. Which brings us to our next essential tool, and that is an iron and something to iron on. It doesn't have to be an ironing board if you don't have one. You can fold up some towels and you can use that. It will work just fine. But I do really recommend having an iron, not just to pre-press your fabric should you need to, but ironing down seam allowances is really important often to getting a really nice finish for your seams. Next is safety pins, and I just have like ones from the dollar store in a Ziploc baggie. They come in very, very handy, especially if you can use them to draw drawstrings and elastic through waistbands if you need to. You can, if you have to step away from a project for a while, you can safety pin notes to your pieces of fabric so that you know where you've left off. They're just a good all-around thing to have. And the next thing is hand sewing needles, which you can easily get at the dollar store. Even if you're planning on sewing everything by machine, have some hand sewing needles kicking around. I keep having to get up because there's a fly buzzing around my head. Anyway, let's keep going. You're also going to want to stock up on whatever common colors of thread you might use. I recommend always having black and white kicking around, but if there are colors that you know that you're going to wear a lot of, I also keep around navy blue and gray and red because those are colors that I like to wear. Now, this is one of the things that I'm going to tell you to not get at the dollar store. In fact, thread is one of those things you really get what you pay for. One of the other common things that can cause you a lot of issues with your sewing machine, having like broken threads and things bunch up, is the quality of your thread. I used to buy the stuff in the bin that said 3 for $1 whenever I went to the fabric store, but I regretted it and I ended up like not even saving it for hand sewing. I just threw it all out, which was such a waste, and I hated to do it, but it was useless. It was terrible, terrible thread. So go ahead and bypass the bargain bin, head straight to the back wall of your fabric store or wherever they keep. I use Gutterman. Use whatever kind of the premium thread is that your fabric store carries. It is a thing worth spending money on. And of course, you definitely can't fit anything to you without a measuring tape. Again, you can get these at the dollar store, but they're also very cheap at your regular fabric store. If you are somebody who wants a longer measuring tape, then make sure that you look for a quilting tape. You might have to actually go to a quilting store for that, but they are a little bit longer. I also recommend having one of these little tailor's rulers or hem rulers. There is like a little slider in it so that you can sort of mark a size, and if you're having to measure the same size over and over again, as in with a hem, it just kind of makes things a little bit easier. But having just a small ruler when you're doing fiddly little bits is a lot easier than having to maneuver something big around. Again, these are super inexpensive. Have one or two kicking around. Quite possibly one of my most favorite sewing tools is the awl. This is a basic sewing awl, really inexpensive. I have this super cool vintage ice pick that I use. It's really handy for sometimes you need to run small things like straps or whatever through your sewing machine and your fingers just get in the way and it's frustrating. So using your awl to sort of guide fabric through, it's handy for puncturing holes if you're putting in snaps. It just is the tool that just keeps on giving. You never know when you're gonna need it. And of course, no beginner sewing tool list could be complete without your stitch rippers. These are gonna be your new best friends. I recommend having a few of them kicking around because they're one of those things that easily goes missing. I don't know how it happens. Now this little sort of hooked scalpel style is my favorite. Because I find that I can really get into tight stitches really well. These are the ones that most of us have seen with the little red ball on. I still keep these around though because they are super, super helpful. When you use your pokey end to pick out a stitch, then you turn it around, put your red ball side in, and you can just push it down the seam without ripping your fabric, for the most part, usually. Now you're also gonna need something to mark your fabric with, be it darts or like points to match up a sleeve or whatever. You need something that can be easily removed from the fabric. If all you're ever having to mark out is like the outside line, go ahead, use a pen, use a pencil, it doesn't matter. But if you're marking out like where a dart peak is, you need something that's gonna be able to be removed really easily. So there are air erasable and water erasable markers. There are chalk pens. There are pencils, which I probably have kicking around here too. There's also Taylor's chalk, which comes in a variety of colors. There's so many different marking tools, and this is just... There are also these little doodads, which are filled with chalk, and they have a little pokey wheel, and you can mark lines with those. I feel like this is one thing that there just is so many different options. As long as you have something that will mark fabric easily, that you can wash out easily, that's key. So let's get into that second category of things that are universally like helpful, but not a necessity. You can gather these things as you go. First up, rotary cutters. Rotary cutters and the accompanying cutting mat. These allow you to not have to pin your patterns in place. Instead, you can just weight your pattern down and cut around it. I have two different sizes here. This little one is really handy for going around arm size and collar lines. This is the one that I use the most though, and I just use those on my cutting mat. If you are going to use a rotary cutter and a cutting mat, then you're going to want something to weight your pattern down. Literally, you can use anything. There are a ton of different options. First of all, grab crap that you have around your house. Grab spoons from your cutlery drawer, whatever, like things, you just need to hold the pattern down. It's not like it's gonna try and get up and walk away, so it doesn't have to be, you know, weighted down very heavily. You can use clean hardware. If you have a garage that has a bunch of bits and bobs kicking around, grab those. This is actually my husband's for doing leather work. It's a little leather bag that is filled with buckshot. Like literally anything can be a pattern weight. There are of course pattern weights that you can purchase. This one has little spikes on it so that you can push it right into the cutting mat. I honestly don't feel like it's necessary. I mean, maybe if you're sewing during an earthquake, but like you should be doing other things during an earthquake, I feel. So it's not something you actually have to spend your money on. Now, to go with your rotary cutter and your cutting mat, you're gonna want a clear ruler. It doesn't have to be one this big. This one for me is the same width as the narrower width on my cutting mat, which I find really helpful when I'm trying to line up a straight line and I want to be able to see what my measurements are on the edges of my mat. Comes in super handy. If you're a quilter, you're already sitting there going, yes, yes, this is everything. It truly is. There are times too when you are cutting out things like strips for straps or ties or whatever, and you don't necessarily need to use a pattern piece, you just need a straight line. Or maybe you're working on a garment that has a straight line and it becomes easier to follow the line of your ruler with your rotary cutter than following it freehand. So these are worth their weight in gold. Now, if you are somebody who has to pull through a lot of drawstrings or elastics through things, I mean, the whole safety pin thing works, but a bodkin, it's a little bit better. It's a longer span for you to push fabric over, so it's gonna get things through faster. And there are several different varieties of these too. This is just a pair of tweezers essentially that have sort of some grippy teeth on the end. And there's this little jump ring that you can slide down it so that this grabs on really tight. And I find over a safety pin, these will hold on better too, because sometimes when you're using a safety pin to push through fabric, sometimes it'll open on you and you wind up sticking it in your thumb instead. Oh, that fly needs to die. Now, cutting tools that you may want to add, one would be pinking shears. If you're working only on like stretch fabrics and fabrics that don't fray, these are not going to be useful to you. These are specifically for fabrics that fray. And even if you're going to do a nice seam finish or something, some fabrics fray so bad that you can lose your fabric while you're just like getting your garment together to sew it. So these can come in really handy for that. Even for things like this sheer fabric, it's helpful. The other thing are these little nippers. Again, not something that is expensive. Obviously, yes, you can absolutely just use your scissors to cut all of your threads. Where these are handy is they're more efficient. They're spring-loaded, which means that when you let go of them, they automatically return to an open position. So especially if you're somebody who, you know, maybe you have difficulty with your hands, maybe you have arthritis, you're only having to do half the motion to cut. You're only having to close them. You're not having to physically open them again. And I just find they're fast, they're small, they tuck next to your machine really easily, much more easily than my big shears do. So I find them handier to keep right next to my machine, and I can cut my threads really quickly as I'm pulling things through my machine. Next are thimbles. And again, I have an entire video on thimbles here if you want to see the different kinds and what they're good for. If you're doing a lot of hand sewing, they really will save your fingers. These rubbery ones, if you have arthritis in your fingers, they just help you more easily grab that needle and pull it through so you're not having to pinch as hard. So they're really beneficial for that as well. I didn't put them on my essentials list because let's be honest, we've all been like, oh, I could really use a thimble. Oh well, and then like chewed up our fingers sewing things. We've all been there. I know we have. Now, although glass beaded pins will get you through an entire sewing career with no problems at all, I also do like these little quilting clips. It really is a personal preference thing. I really like using them for thicker fabrics. I like them for fabrics that are really slippy, that my pins like to just fall out of, because these don't fall out of anything. But they are something that, again, down the road, you can add to your sewing arsenal, and they do come in really handy. Now, earlier I had mentioned sharpening your own scissors. And for that, I recommend getting a sharpening stone. This one we got at a garage sale or something, I can't even remember. You don't have to go out and spend a whole lot of money. They often are kicking around in secondhand stores. Something to keep your eye out for, but being able to sharpen your own scissors is super handy. Not only will it save you money, rather than taking in your scissors to have them professionally sharpened, but my scissors always need to be sharpened at like 9:30 at night. And I don't want to wait for the next day. So it is so beneficial to have your own sharpening stone and learn how to sharpen your own scissors. Again, I have a video, I will link it below. Now, this last one is another one that is like a personal preference thing. This is another way of marking your patterns, and that is with a tracing wheel and tracing paper. So this paper has chalk on it. I can put it in between my pattern and my fabric, run this little pokey wheel around the pattern, and then I can take the pattern off completely and just cut my fabric out. Some people are all about this method for transferring their patterns. Some people are really not. One of the benefits of using this method is if you are somebody who does not like to cut your patterns out, like you like to keep them intact with all the sizes intact, and you also don't feel like tracing out your patterns for whatever size you're going to use, you can leave your patterns intact and use this to mark your fabric. So there we go. In my humble opinion, those are the must-haves and the sort of secondary must-haves to starting sewing your own wardrobe. Again, seasoned sewers, if you have anything to add to this list, please put it in the comments below. And let's really help out these new sewers, because I've been seeing, especially during this past year and a half of craziness, like so many more people are coming into sewing, and I feel like we're hitting another wave of like where people had started sewing and they had started with like home crafts and quilts and stuff like that, and now they're kind of going into the challenge of sewing wardrobe stuff and kind of building that skill set. So absolutely let us know in the comments if I missed anything or what your favorite tools are that you absolutely could not live without. All right, that's all I've got for you this week. I'll see you next week.